25 years ago, the last chapter began in the tragic Lindbergh kidnapping. A police net closed in on Bruno Richard Hauptmann, ending a 2-year hunt for a man who kidnapped and then killed the infant son of Charles Lindbergh. In Hauptmann's New York garage was found $14,000 in marked bills.
Welcome to the Bridgeton Beacon for this series on the crime of the century, the Lindbergh kidnapping and the murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. We've got former New Jersey Assistant Prosecutor Meg McCormick Horner interviewing various authors on the topic. This episode is part 1 with the author of the book Cemetery John, which is an exploration of his family's unique interaction and relationship with the Lindbergh kidnapping and a perspective on who they believe the actual kidnappers were. So this is Robert Zorn with Meg McCormick Horner. Please enjoy.
Other damning evidence, an artist's sketch from a description by the ransom go-between. Handwriting specimens that definitely link the Bronx carpenter with the crime. And written on a door, the phone number of Dr. Condon, the innocent agent who paid the ransom. Circumstantial evidence overwhelming in its impact.
On March 1st, 1932, Charles Lindbergh's 20-month-old son was kidnapped from his nursery on the second floor of their home near Hopewell, New Jersey. Now, almost a century later, the Lindbergh kidnapping is one of the most famous crimes to have occurred in New Jersey. The trial of Richard Bruno Hauptmann, ultimately convicted of kidnapping the baby, was called the trial of the century. And the kidnapping eventually led to the creation of what is known as the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping across state lines a federal crime. Here today to discuss his 2012 book, Cemetery John, the undiscovered mastermind of the Lindbergh kidnapping, is Robert Zorn. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to begin by asking you, how is it that you became interested in the Lindbergh baby kidnapping such that it led you to write your fascinating book, Cemetery John?
First of all, thank you for the compliment. My hands kind of tightened on the steering wheel because my father was, although he had a great sense of humor, he was a fellow that was very sober-minded and serious, and so I couldn't imagine what he was going to tell me. He said, well, you remember how I told you that I grew up in a German neighborhood, the South Bronx? I said, yes. Well, I said, well, when I was a kid, a teenager, there was a man who lived 3 doors down from us, and he was a German immigrant named John Knoll, and he had come to the States in 1925 and moved to Jackson Avenue, where our family had also just moved in 1925. Again, my father was born in 1916. So my dad's story starts really in the summer of 1931, in June of 1931. And this fellow, John Knoll, took my dad on excursions. He kind of took my dad under his wing. My father was one of 6 kids. He had 5 sisters. He was the only boy in the family. And one day he invites my dad to go to Palisades Amusement Park in North Jersey. And this was like, for a kid in the middle of the Depression, this was like going to Disneyland. It was a really big deal. They had the world's largest saltwater swimming pool. John had taken my dad swimming in Yonkers before. Anyway, so they go to this park, which sat at the top of the Palisades cliffs. And strangely, John does not go swimming there that day. So my dad goes for his swim. And after he finishes, he showers in the bathhouse and changes back into his clothes. And John and my dad are exiting the park. Well, outside the park waiting for John are 2 men. One of them is his younger brother, Walter, whom my father knew. John and Walter lived they rented rooms for $10 a month each from an elderly widow named Emma Schaefer. And anyway, but my dad did not know the other man, who to him seemed rather tall. Anyway, the men began speaking to one another in German, the three men, John, Walt, and Walter. And John knows that my dad doesn't know how to speak German because my grandparents on my father's side had been brought up in the U.S., born in the U.S., and so German wasn't spoken in the Zorn home. So John felt free and comfortable about speaking in German in front of my father with his brother Walter, this third man. But my dad, he's a pretty astute and sharp kid. He was a very, very bright fellow who ended up being the first person in his family to go to college and ended up earning a graduate degree at Columbia University and so forth. But anyway, my dad picks up that John, the third man that is there, John is calling him Bruno. And that they're talking about some place called Englewood. Well, then John does something very strange. Here he's got a kid who's 15 years old. He'd never been out of the state of New York before in his life. Of course, again, this is the middle of the Depression, and there was no money to be taking a family of 8 on vacations anywhere. And then John tells my father, "You go on Scram. You go on home alone." And of course, my dad said, "Well, aren't you going to come with me?" He goes, "No, you go on home alone." So my father was really shocked by this, and he watched him go off, John go off with his brother Walter and this third guy, Bruno, that he was calling Bruno. So my dad is ferrying back across, and he was a bright kid. He knew how to get back to the Bronx and back home. But he's ferrying across the Hudson and saying to himself, what, looking at the dark waters of the Hudson, looking back at the Palisades Cliffs and the park and the Ferris wheel at the top of it. He said, what was that all about? Here, this fellow is supposed to be my neighbor, my friend, and so forth. He's taught me all about stamp collecting, and I help him with his stamp collection. I'm hanging out with him all the time. And here he just ditches me in New Jersey. This makes no sense at all. Well, you fast forward to December of 1963. At that point, my father was the chief economist of the Republic National Bank of Dallas. My father he's 47 years old at this point, and he walks into his barber shop the day and night for. He reaches for a magazine, and off at the top of the stack is a magazine called True, and in it was an article about the Lindbergh kidnapping. Now, when Bruno Hauptmann was caught in September of 1934, this is 2.5 years after the Lindbergh kidnapping had taken place. This was the greatest manhunt in history at that point, in American history, the hunt for the Lindbergh kidnappers. And all that time they were looking for a gang. They were not looking for a one person, but they were looking for a gang. They concluded that multiple people were involved in this thing. So anyway, the gist of this article was that Hauptmann was no doubt involved in this thing, and he went to the electric chair in 1936, April 1936. But there were likely accomplices that he had that he never ratted out, that were never caught. So when Hauptmann was caught, all of the investigative agencies, the New Jersey State Police, NYPD, J. Edgar Hoover's Division of Investigation, as the FBI was originally called, and the Treasury Department's investigative unit, they all shut down their investigations. So Hauptmann goes to the electric chair, and nobody is looking for accomplices at this point. So
they had their man. They had their man, right?
They had their man. They had spent a fortune, and they were ready to have it done with. All these investigative units had spent incredible amounts of time and money, and they caught Hauptmann, and they then made the trial of the century, as you called it. They made a lone wolf deal, and anyway, so my dad's reading this article, and he's reading about of course, he knew about the name Bruno Hauptmann. That the name was well known. But when Hauptmann was caught, my dad was in literally his first month of college. He was the first kid in his family to go to college. He had 3 older sisters. So anyway, my father's reading about Bruno Hauptmann, and he's reading about how there was a man calling himself John who had collected the ransom in a Bronx cemetery. Now, there were 2 meetings between the intermediary, man named Condon, John F. Condon, the elderly educator, whom my grandfather knew from the Bronx Old Timers Club. And so there was a fellow named John who had met with Condon at both Woodlawn Cemetery, where my dad had just buried his own father in August of 1963, and then also one at St. Raymond's Cemetery, also in the Bronx. And then my dad is reading about how the Lindberghs had lived in Englewood, New Jersey, while they were built with Anne Morrow Lindbergh's very wealthy family in a 40,000 square foot home, while their own home near Hopewell on 389 acres in the Sauerland Mountains was being built. So my dad said, wait a minute, that day in 1931, 9 months before the crime took place, a guy named John is talking to a guy named Bruno about a place called Englewood, and wherever they were going, I couldn't tag along. So my dad ultimately believed that he came to the conclusion that cemetery, this unidentified or improperly identified kidnapper known as Cemetery John, who became known as Cemetery John, was in fact his neighbor, John Knoll.
So he read that magazine and the light bulb went off.
Yeah, that switched, and then he dove in and did the research. And my dad was haunted by his belief that 2 men had gotten away with murder. And my father had tried to reach out to Lindbergh through a mutual acquaintance. It was a friend of my father's named Robert Anderson, who was the former Secretary of the Treasury under President Eisenhower. And Bob Anderson sat on the board of directors of Pan Am with Charles Lindbergh. And my dad wrote a letter to Lindbergh saying that I have very interesting information about that sheds light on the kidnapping. And anyway, Bob Anderson handed this letter to Lindbergh at a Pan Am meeting. And this is probably not long after Lindbergh was diagnosed with lymphoma, and he really didn't want to reopen this old wound.
What year would that have been?
That was 1972. This is 40 years after the kidnapping. Lindbergh died in 1974. And but Lindbergh kept the letter, and it is in pristine condition in his papers at Yale, where they have 3,000 boxes of the Lindbergh's papers. And I've spent many, 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 many days there, as well as 130 days at the New Jersey State Police Museum, where they have 250,000 files on the case and all the the kidnap ladder, all the ransom notes, the ransom envelopes, and all the other artifacts of the case there. So anyway, my father tried through a close friend of his who was a former Army intelligence officer during World War II, spoke fluent German, a man named Herman Traub, who was my dad's best friend from his days at CCNY, who became an attorney in New York. And Traub investigated John and spoke to him, John Knoll, who was then living in New Jersey. And even, again, this was in 1973, even 41 years after the crime, Knoll was lying about the timing of his move to New York, still acting like someone who had something to hide. So anyway, the years went on, and my dad and I started to, sketch out ideas for doing a book on this. And as it turns out, he died on Christmas Eve of 2006 at the age of 90, about 3 weeks short of his 91st birthday. And this is one thing my father really wanted to have done. It wasn't for publicity purposes, but he believed that the telling of his story would bring a measure of justice to the case. Anyway, but I held my dad's hand and said, "Dad, I'm going to take up your investigation and someday tell your story to the world." And at this point, he was too weak to speak, but he looked up into my eyes and smiled and squeezed my hand, and I knew he was happy. So that, Meg, is how I got involved in this story.
Hey, thanks again for listening in, and this is just a quick reminder that the best place to check the show out and see all the video episodes, in this case it's an audio episode, but we do have more information about the authors and their books, and it's all at bridgetonbeacon.com.
And you did just that. You continued his work to find the truth of what happened. He began his kind of investigation, so to speak, in the early 70s, but he didn't tell you the story until 1980. Is that accurate?
No, it was 1963 when he came across this information.
Right, but when you were
and he was, he had it in the back of his mind, and John had given him a lot of stamps, Lindbergh theme stamp. John taught my dad all about stamp collecting.
How old was John? What was the age difference between John and your father?
Well, John was born in 1904, and my dad was born in 1916. So when the crime was committed, John was a 27-year-old man, and his brother Walter was 23.
Okay, so your dad was 15. And so 1963, your dad reads the article in True magazine as he's sitting in the barber shop in Dallas at the age of 47. Light bulb
Correct.
kind of goes off, and he begins his quest to kind of find the truth. Got it.
Amazingly, one of the amazing parts of this story is I was able to, there was only so much information that could be found out about John and Walter Knoll, because they were never suspects in the case. There's 250,000 files at the New Jersey State Police Museum, where as I mentioned, I've been there probably 130 times doing research. So I had to, go through ship records and immigration records and documents and applications to become a citizen and all this kind of stuff. And I was able to find, some stuff that was pretty compelling. Like, for example, the first time Knoll ever goes back to Germany, he left Germany in January 1925. And the first time he goes back to Germany, he goes back in splendor on the SS Manhattan. And he makes his return he leaves Europe to return to the States on February 13th, 1935, the very day that Bruno Hauptmann is convicted in a New Jersey court of murdering Charles Lindbergh's baby. So the very day, at which point, obviously, from following the international newspapers, this case exploded internationally. I mean, Lindbergh was by far the most famous person in the world. This was by far the most famous child in the world. And so at that point, Knoll knew for sure that Hauptmann did not rat him out on the witness stand. So, I mean, I found several details like that were very compelling, but it wasn't enough. And so the only option I really had was to go to his family. And through nephews, I found out, I got his obituary and found out that he had a sister named Agnes Breiling who had lived in Mount Clemens, Michigan. And then I got her obituary. And then from that, I got found out that she had 3 sons who were still alive. And this was one of the more difficult cold calls I ever had to make in my life. But I ended up calling her son Rudolph, or Rudy as he was known. And, of course I couldn't tell them, say that my dad thinks your uncle killed the Lindbergh's child. So I had to, just say that, I got him on the phone, and I said, "Is this Rudolph Breiling?" He said, "Yes, this is Rudy Breiling." I said, "Rudy, may I ask, are you the son of Agnes Breiling?" "Well, yeah, I sure am." I said, "Well, man, are you that would make you the nephew of John and Walter Knoll? He goes, yeah, did you know him? I said, no, but my father did. He grew up in the Bronx, 3 doors down from when John helped him with his stamp collection and so on and so forth. And I was just wondering, could I come meet you? And so he invited me to come to his home. And as it turned out, my best friend from my school in Dallas, St. Mark's, lived nearby in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. And Rudy and his wife Sharon were in Macomb, Michigan. And anyway, so I get invited to dinner, and Rudy gives me a big handshake. He has his whole family invites me over, and his wife Sharon comes up and gives me a great big hug at the door. I'd never spoken to her, and I found that was a little bit odd. But we've ended up becoming the closest of friends. Anyway, I ended up getting information about John. I mean, he was a very, very strange fellow. I got photographs of him. It is a dead ringer to the police sketch that was done of Cemetery John. And through Rudy, I ended up meeting John's daughter-in-law, John's only son, with whom he had virtually no relationship, had recently died. But I went to Tucson, Arizona to meet John's daughter-in-law, Adrian. And through that, I got this photograph of John sailing on the SS Manhattan in splendor, dated in December of 1934, right before Halpett's to go on trial. And then I got another photograph of John from Adrian that showed that he had a deformity in his left thumb, which was the most prominent feature described by the intermediary of Cemetery John.
Let's switch gears for a minute and talk about what you learned about the day of the kidnapping. The baby was put down to sleep, and I guess had an early nap time, and then would be woken up for dinner, and then put back to bed for the night. And shortly thereafter was discovered missing by the nursemaid, Betty Gow.
Yes, at 10 o'clock. Yes,
right.
When that was her time to. That was her time to check on the child.
Right, and some indication that they thought perhaps Charles Lindbergh had played a prank. He was apparently known for his pranks, and then shortly thereafter, a ransom note was found. Talk to me a little bit about the ransom notes, and the initial investigation, and how those ransom notes tie in to the idea that John Knoll was in fact involved with Haltman.
Well, I could get into very deep detail about this, but I will, from the beginning, I will just say that there was a symbol in the ransom notes. There were 15 notes in total, and there was a symbol on notes number 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And it was a symbol composed of two, it was called a signature. It was referred to as a signature in the ransom notes. There were two interlocking blue circles that were stamped onto the page. They are exactly the size of $50. And in the area of intersection, it was a mark made with a cork. I would say it is between the size of a dime and the size of a pin. You'll read books about it. I've never seen it accurately described. There are two little lines that are in the circles, one in each circle outside the area of intersection, and there are 3 holes punched through the signature. One that pierces the red dot and cork mark, and then the other two to the just outside the edges of the blue circles. And so this was a way that Lindbergh could know and the police could know that they were dealing with the bona fide kidnappers of their son rather than with copycats.
Where were the ransom notes discovered?
Well, the first one was left on the windowsill of the baby's nursery, and then the others were then mailed from different locations. Just again, John Knoll is a philatelist, a stamp collector. This is his great passion. And he knows all about cancellations, and that he's going to confuse people by mailing some from the Bronx, some from Brooklyn, some from Manhattan, and so forth. So that also is a fact that certainly a philatelist. It's something a clever philatelist would have done.
What's interesting to me is that in today's day and age, those notes could have been analyzed for different types of forensic evidence, DNA, etc. And obviously, this all occurred well before any of that. I'm interested in how the investigation and the trial would have been different had the crime happened today. So the case, though, was very dependent on handwriting analysis, correct?
Yeah. The most damning things to Hauptmann were of course he's found with $14,600 of the $50,000 ransom, and this was most of the money was squirreled away in secret compartments. Most of the money was squirreled away in secret compartments in his garage.
It's not a good fact for him.
Pardon me?
It's not a good fact for him, right?
No, not a good fact at all.
Yeah.
And also, there were Hauptmann was a carpenter, and he was a very talented carpenter. I mean, he was not the imbecile that a lot of people have portrayed him to be. This was a very inventive device that he created. You couldn't have found anything like it in the Sears or Montgomery Ward catalogs of the day, which was the equivalent of Amazon back then. But the ladder was made in sections that could be transported in his 1930 Dodge DD sedan, so that the sections would nest. There were 3 sections that nested into one another, and they could be fit into his sedan to go from the front windshield to the rear window, with a few inches to spare. And they were connected. The sections were connected with dowel pins. As it turned out, only 2 of the sections were needed, and the third unused section that was called rail 16 was one of the rails. And as it turns out, that rail was once shown. There was a wood expert named Arthur Kaler who came from Wisconsin to do forensic work on the ladder, and Kaler determined that this rail 16 was once part of the same piece of wood as a floorboard in Hauptmann's attic. There was a little gap in between, but you could see where the wood grain, the lines in the wood grain would match up. So this was a very, 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 very damning thing for Hauptmann as well. And then when Lindbergh, on the night that the ransom was paid, drove the intermediary Condon to St. Raymond Cemetery. And from a distance, there was a man inside the cemetery calling out for Dr. Condon. He said, "Hey, doctor." And anyway, Lindbergh is catty corner, and he's a fellow who doesn't have good hearing, for one thing. For all those years of being in open cockpit planes, I've spoken to his daughter Reeve about this, and she said he was kind of almost deaf in one ear, and he always would ask her to enunciate more clearly and so forth. But he did not have good. His hearing was not good. But then years later, so this would have been April of 1932 when Lindbergh hears this, and then at the trial in January of 1935, Lindbergh said that was Hauptmann's voice, and that was really, 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 really bad for Hauptmann, obviously, to have this very sympathetic figure, the father, say that was Hauptmann's voice. When he had earlier said there's no way he'd be able to identify it, then he changes his tune and says that's Hauptmann's voice. The intermediary,
which is, by the way, a piece of testimony that likely would never be admissible today.
Yeah, well, and the defense attorney didn't challenge it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the defense attorney did a very poor job as well. So,
right.
Hauptmann was really in rough shape.
Explain to me who Dr. Condon was, and why he was chosen as the intermediary, and was the meetup coordinated with the police, or how did that transpire? If you can explain that for our listeners.
Sure. Dr. Condon was in his early 70s. He was a retired, semi-retired educator. He had been a principal in Bronx schools for many years. My grandfather knew him. He was kind of a big blowhard. My grandfather referred to him as an old coot. They were in this Bronx old timers club together. It was kind of a social organization of men that had been in the Bronx for a long time. Anyway, Condon was outraged that Lindbergh's child was kidnapped. And so he had a relationship with the editor of the Bronx Home News, which was the newspaper that my dad was a newsboy, a paper boy for. And anyway, Condon writes a letter to the editor of the Bronx Home News saying that he'd like to be helpful in returning this child to his parents. He'll offer $1,000 of his own money, so on and so forth. Well, the Bronx Home News then publishes a page one little squib. I mean, just a tiny little squib in the lower right-hand corner of the front page saying that Dr. Condon will offer to act as an intermediary in the case. That isn't exactly what he did, but that's what the newspaper said. And anyway, again, my father is the guy that is the kid that is delivering the newspaper in the area, so he's dropping off copies to John Knoll. And so anyway, Knoll reads this squib in the newspaper and writes a letter to Condon and saying, you may act as the intermediary. Lindbergh had said, he wanted to have some mobsters get involved and be the intermediary. And one of the ransom letters said, we're not going to accept any intermediary from your side. We're the ones in control. And so John Knoll reads this, or the kidnappers read this, and they write a letter. The kidnappers write a letter to Condon saying that he may act as the go-between. And then he writes a letter to Lindbergh saying, create a list of instructions to follow.
And all these letters appear to be in the same handwriting?
Probably. I'm not a handwriting expert. Mm-hmm. The first letter looks like the indifferent, the work of an indifferent pupil in a fifth-rate grammar school. Might have been done with the opposite hand. Who knows? My sense is that Knoll likely dictated the letters to Hauptmann and then addressed the envelopes himself, and then took charge of mailing them. That is my best estimation of what happened. There was actually a very high-tech, sophisticated software program that was developed by a software expert at the University of Buffalo, Dr. Sargur Srihari, and the Knowles handwriting was compared to the handwriting on the ransom envelopes, and there was a 96% probability that Knoll wrote those. But
Wow.
I don't think that he wrote the. I think he most likely dictated the letters to Halpin. That's what is and you know, the handwriting analysts in the Lindbergh case said that this was Lindbergh, that was Halpin's handwriting in the ransom notes. But anyway, so so Condon calls up the Lindbergh residence late in the night and says he's got this letter, and then he describes this strange symbol in the lower right-hand corner. And they know immediately that this is the right deal. So Condon goes out to the Lindbergh home very late at night, gets there well past midnight, and Lindbergh sees that the symbol matches that of the earlier ransom notes, and he agrees to have Condon be the intermediary. So that's how Condon got involved.
Was there only the one, I'll call it a meetup, so to speak, to give the ransom money over, or was there more than one meetup?
There were two. The money had not yet been assembled, and but Condon thought that it was a good idea to go ahead and meet with the representative of the kidnappers anyway. And so he did, although they didn't have the money. So they met the first time at Woodlawn Cemetery, and John Knoll was inside. Cemetery John was inside this. And again, this is a magnificent cemetery. Anyway, John gets spooked by a guard inside the cemetery and does an amazing leap over the gate, the front gate at the corner of 233rd and Jerome Avenue, and runs across the street into Van Cortlandt Park. So anyway, John agrees to send the baby's sleeping suit, which he had taken off the baby, and he said that way you'll know that we have it. And of course, this is not proof of life. And anyway, they send the sleeping suit, and they arranged to have a second meeting. At the second meeting at St. Raymond Cemetery in the Bronx is where the $50,000 is handed over.
And that was the total amount of ransom money that was provided to the purported kidnappers, correct?
Correct. They had raised it from 50 to 70, and then Condon, at the second meeting, negotiated John down from 70 to 50, and which infuriated the Treasury Department individuals, because he took out the $50 $450 bills, which would be the most difficult to pass, and these were all gold certificates, and which ultimately, after President Roosevelt took office and got us off the gold standard, it became illegal to have all these ransom notes, these gold certificates and gold coin. And so this was part of the Treasury Department's brilliant strategy, even though at the time of the kidnapping they were not illegal, but they were hoping that this was what would happen, and sure enough it did. And Hauptmann was ultimately caught passing a $10 gold note at a Warner Quinlan gas station in Upper Manhattan, and the gas station attendant became a little suspicious of Hauptmann, and he wrote down the license plate 4U1341 on the back of it, and ultimately that got traced back to Hauptmann. That's how he got caught.
Were law enforcement involved in the two meetups at all? No.
Lindbergh refused to allow. He just wanted his child back. He didn't care about the prosecuting. If he got his child back, he was going to be happy. Of course, the child was long dead by then, which obviously he did not know. But no, he refused to allow the authorities to get involved. And of course, you would never be able to do that.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, were law enforcement aware of what he was doing? Because if so, it does seem like they deferred, and understandably so to some extent, looking back. But I don't think that would be permitted now today.
No, clearly not. So,
did Dr. Condon testify at the trial?
He did. Interestingly, when Hauptmann got caught, he said, "No, this is not the man." But the prosecutor, a very ambitious young guy, 39-year-old guy named David Willance, who still there's a huge law firm in New Jersey bearing his name. This was a very big deal for him. He wanted to become a big Democratic Party kingpin and kingmaker, and he was going to do whatever it took. And so he ended up changing his tune. And I'm sure he was presented with a lot of evidence that showed that Hauptmann was involved, the ladder, the money, handwriting, and so forth. So he changed his tune.
In what way? On the stand, or?
Oh, he said that John is Bruno Richard Hauptmann on the stand. So he completely changed his tune. He
had previously given a statement indicating otherwise.
So he did that. And that was Hauptmann had just been shaking his head as he's watching this. I mean,
wow.
This is a nightmare.
And there's so many rules now related to out of court identifications, in court identifications, etc. So that's another interesting observation as to how the trial may have gone differently had it been held today. This evolution of these identification type of laws.
One thing, there's no electric chair and there's no death penalty in New Jersey now.
Well, that is true. That is true. Hauptmann ever give a statement?
Oh, he said, he proclaimed his innocence to the end.
Right. As did his wife till her death.
Well, it's very clear. I mean, I don't think he was convicted 100% on circumstantial evidence. I don't think he thought he was going to get convicted. Mm-hmm. And so then he would have had, if he had then confessed to having been involved in this thing, then he would have had to tell his wife, "I've been lying to you all along." He would have then lost the support of the German American community, which had supported him greatly. They would have thought he was a rat. And then, but he was also very concerned about his family name and his name of he had his own toddler son at the time, who was born in 1933, the year after the kidnapping. And he wanted his son to believe that he had been unfairly, unjustly convicted, wrongfully convicted. And for the rest of her life, Anna Hauptmann tried to clear his name with no great success. But this was what was told to this Manfred Hauptmann all his life.
Trial of the century. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Robert, for sharing what led you to this fascinating story and the research that you uncovered. It's I, as I shared with you before we started recording, just became interested in this because I am a former prosecutor, current criminal defense attorney in New Jersey, and wanted to do a series on this podcast, New Jersey Criminal Podcast, about the most famous case in New Jersey, the trial of the century that happened right here. And so I'm just kind of scratching the tip of the iceberg here in my, education on this case, and had a general idea of how I wanted to go about learning about it. And I thought the best way to do it would be to speak with the experts. And so I'm just so grateful for you, for sharing the story. I would encourage my listeners to read Cemetery John, the undiscovered mastermind of the Lindbergh Kidnapping. And Robert, you are just so well known and well respected on this topic, and I'm honored that you took so much time to walk us through your story and, more importantly, the story of the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh's child.
Well, and my pleasure. So nice to be with you today, and thank you so much for the invitation. It was a joy and a pleasure.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation about New Jersey true crime and history. Come back for our next conversation with Judge Lisa Perlman and her book, The Lindbergh Kidnapping Suspect Number 1, The Man Who Got Away. The link to purchase the book is just below the episode on this page here at thebridgetonbeacon.com. But if you're listening on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, it's at the very top of the descriptive texts. We'll take you to the bridgetonbeacon.com so you can learn about the book, learn about the author, purchase the book. Thanks for listening in. We hope you come back for our conversation with Judge Lisa Perlman in our next episode.